Welcome to round 3 of the Winter Mox Emerald Moto League. So I've come back, I made a couple of small changes to the deck, and again I didn't record with OBS for the actual games, so we're going to have to use the Moto replay tool, which is suboptimal, but I didn't want to be distracted by trying to commentate during my matches. So this match is against 4-color control. You can find the deck list in the description of the video. Notably, I thought that this deck was actually very, very well built to beat Blood Moon. Although there's only a small number of basics, a lot of the deck can be cast off those basics, and my opponent's clearly not been overly greedy and has respected the fact that people are going to be playing Blood Moon in not insignificant numbers from the metagame report. And I think, as I've mentioned a couple of times before, it's also pretty significant that the deck lists are open in this tournament. When your opponent knows that you've got Blood Moon and you can be playing it as early as turn 1 or turn 2, it does dramatically change how they play. And as I did in this match, I actually sideboard my moons out on the draw. Obviously, if you can catch people with a single land or a shock land or a triome, great. But yeah, this one's not the same as playing regular paper Magic. Okay, so game 1, this hand is very tempting. Imagine if you brainstorm and you draw 3 cards that are good, suddenly this hand looks great. But it's too much of a trap, it's too slow. I ship it, this hand is excellent. This really exemplifies something I wrote about in my summary of the first round of the tournament. You just want to do something dumb with this deck. You're not just a small red deck, you're a small red deck that plays Nano Acceleration. And here we're going to put Sprite Dragon under Chrome Mox. We'll have perfect mana for the rest of the game. There's a consideration for playing Sprite Dragon, but you don't have a lot of things to play to make it bigger, and you can't play the Mox after it, obviously, so it's really just a 1-1 for quite a while. And Eidolon on turn 1 is just obnoxious. So the Swift is going to go away. The plan is to Eidolon, turn 2 Robber. We'll obviously have very few cards in hand because we've had to Chrome Mox and we've had to Mulligan. Our opponent also mulliganed, but the Chrome Mox discard a card effect will give Robin Hood many cards to steal. So, turn 1, Chrome Mox resolves, our opponent F6'd. I don't know if it comes up on the replay or not, but they did F6 in real life, and that was reassuring. It made me feel pretty confident that Eidolon was going to resolve and therefore gets to trade for at least 2 life at some point. This thing in play makes it rough. Our opponent kept a hand that was leaning on cantrips. Suddenly, they're cut off. They're just going to have to play lands. We do the Robber of the Rich thing. We start attacking for 4. And if your opponent takes the hit from Eidolon, then you can be pretty sure they don't have a removal spell in hand, because any 1-mana removal spell will cost you 2 life when you do cast it, so you might as well just not let it deal you the 2 damage to start with. So you can read this as no Lightning Bolt. My opponent didn't have Fatal Push in their deck, but no Fatal Push, etc. Robber of the Rich steals a card. We're down 4 cards. It steals Volcanic Island, which I thought was somewhat amusing because it may have been the fetch target for the Bloodstained Mire to enable the small red splash and get a blue land with the Mire. But thus far, I was thinking this is really good. If my opponent doesn't do something pretty good next turn, they're going to take another 4 damage. They fetch here. They go to 11, I was thinking 12 at the time, and then Price of Progress is probably going to deal 4 to 6 damage pretty comfortably in this matchup. Even if my opponent is consciously trying to fetch basics, they just can't play all basics. And we can see here, they pass the turn. They're obviously representing a counter spell of some sort, but the problem is on board. So I'm not even going to bother suspending anything until I find out what happens and what I steal with Robber of the Rich. And then Robber hits Pyroblast, which is especially obnoxious if my opponent did have a counterspell in play. Remember, this thing triggers off any rogue that attacks, not just it. It very occasionally comes up with Brazen Borrower. But in this case, I ship for 4 damage, I suspend Drift Bolt, and we pass the turn. I'm holding Ancient Tomb because I don't think I need to play it for any particular reason, and I'm cognizant that I might draw Brainstorm and want to absolutely maximize the value of the Brainstorm. When I have 2 cards in hand, holding a card does suddenly go up in value for that. My opponent, as you can see, they're prioritizing getting basics. They had a forest in their hand. And here they play Oko. They take 2 damage, and this is a bit of a desperation Oko because there's no real way to make this card good at this point. My opponent Elks my Robber, which is really just trading Oko for the damage on board. They're hitting Robber instead of Eidolon because if Robber attacks, I get to Pyroblast Oko and I can just go straight to the face with 5 damage plus the Rift Bolt. But regardless, leaving Eidolon in play is, this is a game they would probably lose 9 times out of 10, I think, from this point. So I don't even bother pointing the Rift Bolt at Oko. It's just going straight to the face. And my opponent, obviously can do the combat math, has to Force of Will it. They pitch Mana Leak, which is obviously the card they were holding up last round. And in this spot, there's a bit of thinking about should you kill Oko or should you go to the face and put your opponent to 2. Sure, they can make a food, but that only gets them 1 spell, and they have to crack it before they can cast the spell, and you have Price of Progress. Like, if they have Force of Negation here, sure, they just get you. That's assuming they have the Force of Negation. Obviously, if they don't have the Force of Negation, you can kill them. But yeah, there's an interesting thought about if they did happen to have a second 0-mana counterspell, do you leave Oko alive? And I'm inclined to think you wouldn't. I think that winning the game, your ability to win the game when they're locked under Eidolon is much higher if they have to spend their entire turn just making food with Oko. But yeah, so we attack for lethal and our opponent doesn't have any interaction, and we win game 1. So game 2, in terms of sideboarding, I took the Blood Moon and the Magoose of the Moon out, as I said. I think that they're a little difficult to leverage appropriately when your opponent is actively respecting them. My opponent definitely fetched basics in situations there where they could quite easily have gotten dual lands. And on the play, Blood Moon just might not be good enough. If your opponent's already got 2 basics in play, they'll navigate their way out of it quite reasonably. Okay, so for game 2, opponent once again reveals Lutri. This hand sort of looks serviceable, but I was reluctant to keep it simply because the first thing you're doing is casting Koth of the Hammer on turn 4. Turn 3, I suppose, with Chrome Mox. You might draw some things, but you also might not draw some things, and I think the average 6 is a little better than this. These are both late game cards. I cast Price of Progress to win on turn 4 in the first game, but typically these close out the game. They're not putting pressure on early, and even though you might say this is 10 burn, I'm just not optimistic about this winning the majority of games you keep it in. So I ship it. This hand is not really much better, but at least it has a turn 2 Goblin Rabblemaster. And Ancient Tomb is sort of a pseudo spell in that it functions as a bit of a Simian Spirit Guide a lot of the time. Drawing this was quite nice. We're still going to jam Rabblemaster on turn 2. I think waiting to have Red Elemental Blast back up is too optimistic. I don't think you can give your opponent 3 turns where you're not casting spells that pressure them. Even though they're representing that they have a counter spell, I think sometimes you just have to cross your fingers and hope, because they're not going to suddenly not leave mana up in the future. They're going to decide what's best for them based on the cards in their hand. Drawing Simian Spirit Guide, of course, made the whole thought process moot. So I jammed Rabblemaster. Our opponent did indeed have a counterspell, and it got Monkey Blasted. So Mana Leak here gets Red Blasted, this resolves, and at this point I was feeling like I was in a fairly good situation. Letting this, trying to counter this does strongly suggest there's no single removal spell in my opponent's hand. Otherwise, they would probably have just killed it pre-combat. So right now I was thinking that I'm probably going to have this live through the turn, and when this thing attacks, it starts spiraling quite quickly. My opponent does have a pretty good 3-drop into Fairy, which probably buys them enough time to bridge the gap into turns 4, 5, and 6 if they have land drops to make. So yes, this Goblin trades for Teferi, the other Goblin hits my opponent, but they're at 17, it's turn 4, that's a lot more life than they were at last game. So right up to this point, our plays have been basically telegraphed. The only interesting decision was whether to jam Rabble Master on turn 2 or not. I think it was fairly clear that you should. So we hit Teferi here. We play Mox to bluff counter magic just in case that matters. And we hold Wooded Foothills because 2 reasons. One is I don't want Price of Progress to accidentally draw the game if I have to activate Ancient Tomb a few more times. And secondly, again, the Brainstorm thing. This fetch is going to shuffle the Brainstorm if I draw it, and this one's going to get put back. Okay, so I was feeling quite good at this point, and I was feeling even better when my opponent cast Growth Spiral in their main phase, which is very clearly an attempt to draw the land that they don't have, and then didn't put a land into play and just shipped the turn. So, it's a pretty big sign of weakness, and then I drew another burn spell, and I was thinking, cool, like my opponent's at 17 life, I've got 6 points of burn in my hand, that's 11 life. Goblin Rabble Master is going to attack here and get pumped, so we've got 3 damage from the tokens, 5 damage from the Rabble Master. They're at 3 life, functionally. And I gotta admit, I was feeling pretty confident about how this was going to play out at this point, especially because I can respond to anything that happens here with 2 burn spells if I need to. And then my opponent played Timely Reinforcements, which was a backbreaking card. If you want to beat red, and a lot of people have been talking about whether or not 4-color control or 3 to 4-color mid-range decks are favoured against red, this is the card you play in your sideboard to beat up on red decks. One card, the board's changed immediately from my opponent probably being dead through any one blocker or any one removal spell to I simply am multiple turns behind. I can't attack, they're at 15 life, I can't burn them out, it's all bad, and if they have a Snapcaster Mage or a Jace Fringe Prodigy, the game probably ends, but they've got multiple extra cards. Flashing this back would be probably game over. Okay, so I rip a land, which is not particularly great. And there's a decision here about what to attack with. I think attacking with just the 4 1/1s is correct. You can see I choose not to attack with Rabble Master. If they double block Rabble Master and trade with a token, you can incinerate one of the tokens and that works out okay. But if they just put all 3 in front of Rabble Master, you really don't want to dump 2 burn spells. Your opponent's choked on lands, you can fight your way through a Timely Reinforcements just by overpowering them. You still do have 6 points of burn in your hand. I don't think you need to risk the Rabble Master at this point. And the Sulphur Falls, in retrospect, I probably shouldn't have played. It's not really changing anything or bluffing anything because I've already got this blue source that can't be disrupted. I should have held this in case I drew Brainstorm. So my opponent makes perfectly reasonable blocks. They're holding this against Chomping Rabble Master next turn. And again, I'm sort of thinking, look, yeah, Timely is phenomenal, but if my opponent remains choked on mana and can't really stabilize, this will still run away with the game. Jace Fringe Prodigy has to die. As I said before, flashing back Timely is very bad. So that's going to eat Incinerate, which does. And we untap, we draw Wheel of Fortune. We go straight to combat. So there's an interesting thought process here about when do you want to wheel. Your opponent has 5 cards in hand, so this is probably a good time to wheel because you can play Wooded Foothills, you can Lightning Bolt your opponent's face, and you can wheel. And you draw 7, and they draw 2. If they had missed their 4th land drop, I would have considered not playing it, but getting to 4 lands is probably enough for their deck to function quite well. And drawing 7 cards against drawing 2 cards is excellent. It's much better than if they're also down at 2-3 cards in hand. That becomes significant because, I'm trying to click the OK on my Moto screen. So they have a cute little combat trick in Ice Fang Coatl here, which was a little frustrating because it obviously lets them trade for the Goblin Rabble Master. I was thinking that they might have Snapcaster Mage for no value, but I was very happy with the idea of Lightning Bolt to trade for a Snap with no value. I completely missed Ice Fang Coatl. I obviously tried to bolt pre-blockers, and it turns out they do have Force of Negation, which is a little frustrating. They had to pitch Narset to it, and Narset's quite a good card for them, especially if I've got Wheel of Fortune as my out. this is a little frustrating because they're going to trade for this. The board's going to look bad enough that I'm enticed into casting Wheel of Fortune. Even though my opponent's at 3 cards, it draws them a lot of cards. I don't think I'm likely to win this game if I just say go here. This is a 3-turn clock. I think you can assume they'll deal 1 point of damage to themselves with a fetch land to finalize their mana base. But I just don't think a 3-turn clock of 3/1/1s is doing it. There are simply too many things that can go wrong. Play Wooded Foothills. I fetch first in case I draw both the dual lands, so I get Volcanic into play. And then I wheel. And my opponent loses Ketria Triome, which is a red source, Lightning Helix, which is pretty gross against a small red deck, and Oko. So it turns out that those 3 cards would definitely have been enough to beat 3/1/1s. But the 7 we drew were somewhat underwhelming. Good but not amazing. Our opponent's 7 are definitely more impactful, but there are enough cards here that if our opponent plays 1 blocker to stabilize or just has 1 counterspell, Brazen Borrower could well be enough to get the job done. It turns out our opponent has... they tapped wrong. Turns out our opponent has an Uro, which is a bit of a tempo void here, but next turn they found the island off the wheel, presumably. If they find a green source, they're going to be able to flash it back or escape it from the graveyard, and that's probably going to be good enough. I was hoping they do something else to try and stabilize. There's the green source. And they cantrip into Ether Gust, which is pretty good against us. And then I make a bit of a mistake here. So I fetch with Wooded Foothills, which is just strictly incorrect when you have Delver of Secrets in play. I just was not paying attention and thinking I wanted to get Steam Vents to do enough things next turn. And I forgot that I could filter my draws efficiently with this. So at this point, my thinking is, I've got Blue Blast to save against a removal spell. They probably have a counter spell, but Swift Spear plus Barbering is an extra 3 damage. If this flips, that's 6 damage. If these 3 connect, that's 9 damage. My opponent's at 4. Even gaining 3 from Oko, I can overpower that by flashing Brazen Borrower in their end step. But then Delver doesn't flip, and it reveals Mountain, and I have to draw a Mountain because I screwed up my fetch land. And now I'm just thinking, this is all very underwhelming. I've still got outs. The game's not over, even though Uro is coming back next turn, but my line at this point is to unsummon Uro with Brazen Borrower, and that's traditionally not a winning line a lot of the time. So I deal some irrelevant damage because they're going back up to 11, and I don't want to reveal Barbering, which is why I played the Fiery Islet, because I want to hide the fact that I can get 2 uncounterable damage out of my mana base. My opponent, fairly obviously, is put Uro into play and gain some life, draw some cards, and threaten to take over the game, which they do. They put a couple of lands into play, and at this point I can feel it starting to slip away. I really need quite a good draw step. Brazen Borrower, unsummoning Uro. It's possible I do it on my turn, but working out how much mana I'm going to need to, for the extra point of damage, obviously, but working out how much mana I need and, getting a 3/1 into play now is just significantly better. They obviously don't let this happen. Uro returning to hand is quite good. So turning on Spell Snare is a little frustrating. I crack my Fiery Islet in response in case I draw a Red Blast. I don't. And then I flip Delver. And I flip Delver to Price of Progress, which is pretty much the one card that wins if it resolves for me. I've got 4 non-basics in play, so I go to 2. And my opponent has 3 non-basics and a fetch land they can fail to find with. So this is 7 points of damage. If they don't have any more... I don't think this gets any further basics out of the deck, but they can fail to find. So it's 7 points of burn, and obviously, there's no way to block enough damage from my attackers that it's not a lethal spell. So I do it now knowing that it's going to get countered because I want to pump my Monastery of Suspiria. And It gets Ether Gusted, so my opponent gets their land. Pumping Monster Booster is also just irrelevant here. I cast it first because I want to see if it resolved and for the free damage, but it's obviously going to get eaten. And now, I put it on top because it's still an amazing draw step. I attack with everything except one Goblin because something's got a Champuro, so I don't draw the game with Price of Progress. And then, the sort of unfortunate spanner in the works is that Delver goes away. And I can't even get a basic land, amusingly, because Price of Progress is on top. If my opponent had taken 3 there, they would have been at 7 after the Euro attack, and things would have been a lot dicier for them, because there's 3 power in play, plus a Lavamancer. That's 5 damage. Barbering closes out the game. But, unfortunately, their removal spell was pretty much the cherry on top, because now they're very unlikely to let Price resolve. I still have to try and jam, but it's really my only out. I don't think there's any spell I can draw that is better than Price, other than perhaps Brainstorm, but then Brainstorm is really just redraws to multiple relevant spells. So in this spot, I kind of accepted I'd made a couple of errors. I mean, Deathray Shaman doesn't really change much. Sure, I can gain life, but the game's basically over if it starts doing that. So they put Lutri in their hand. I play Price of Progress after redrawing it for the turn, and they have another 1-mana counterspell. They've got Lutri. I Grim Lavamancered their Deathray Shaman. They've got Lutri to try and eat a Goblin, which I'm forced to Blue Blast because I'm just not optimistic about Blue Blast doing anything else this game. And the game sort of just drags on at this point, but functionally I've missed my chance to win. There's not a lot going on here that is particularly good for me. I still have, theoretical outs, but they're basically all... Time Twister was the theoretical out. They're basically all dependent on me getting lucky, my opponent not having a counterspell. So I ripped the Twister, which I skipped through, unfortunately. And then I have Barbering in my hand, which I need to play now because it uses Threshold, and I need to Grim Lavamancer now because, again, it uses Threshold. So I throw Barbering in my opponent's face because the plan... Sorry, I Grim Lavamancer my opponent's face. I throw Barbering at my opponent's face. The plan, obviously, being to put them to 7, have them at 5 if these two connect, and try and draw 7 cards to do something. And then, sadly, Time Twister does not resolve. My opponent plays Snapcaster Mage, and their graveyard is stacked with various things that they can use to counter it, and I just conceded at this point. So game 2 was quite interesting. Casting the Wheel of Fortune was an interesting turning point, whether or not I had to do it or whether I could afford to wait, as was the decision-making around Price of Progress and the Delver of Secrets, where I screwed up the fetch land. So we went on to the third game. In the third game, I boarded Magoose of the Moon, Blood Moon, etc. back into my deck, because on turn 1, on the play, if you can draw 2 Beasts of Acceleration, they obviously are phenomenal, and even turn 2 on the play, playing out from under them with 1 basic land is quite difficult. So this hand is pretty good as far as this deck goes. I mean, outside Mox hands, you're not really going to get a better starting 7. You got Delver on 1, Misstep to protect it, Magoose on 2, and then a difficult to interact with Beat Stick. I was very happy. So Delver happens. Our opponent plays a tapped Triome, and foolishly, what are these non-basic lands doing? We have Chrome Mox, so Delver doesn't flip. But our opponent foolishly is thinking they'll get 3 colors of mana next turn, and then Magoose turns up to spoil the party. At this point, you've made a Magoose on turn 2. That's probably game-winning in most situations. Our opponent has very few spells they can kill Magoose with whilst locked under Blood Moon, Lightning Bolt being one of them. If they have a basic island, they can use the Hydro Blast effects. But really, and also we have Lightning Bolt covered, but really this is usually game over. Especially if they don't naturally have basic lands in their hand. If your opponent has basic lands to fetch before this comes down or in response, they usually can play around it quite well. But you're the deck that uses red mana, not your opponent. So I would recommend jamming Magoose aggressively on turn 2. Anyway, we then flip Price of Progress. We then reveal Price of Progress to flip Delver. At this point, I was quite happy with how things were looking. This is going to do 4, almost certainly 6 damage to our opponent. There's another 2 damage here. There's 5 damage in play. You know, things are looking pretty good. So I play basic. We attack, and at this point, I'm thinking about whether or not I'm playing Bone Crusher Giant post-combat, or I'm holding up Stomp / Price of Progress. Because my opponent obviously has no counter magic available right now. Then in combat, my opponent has Lightning Bolt. And I tank a little bit on what this means. Obviously, I misstep it. I would like my opponent to not have access to coloured sources of mana. But I tank a little bit on what this means, because with open deck lists, I can see their sideboard. And the one card in their sideboard that is really relevant at this point is Fire Spout. And putting Bone Crusher Giant into play right now gives up 2 points of damage from Stomp. But then next turn it means you have 9 power in play, and Price of Progress is lethal. Whereas if you attack for 5, put them to 9, throw this at their face in their end step, put them to 3, even stomping them isn't lethal. So playing it now does potentially shave a turn off the clock. But Fire Spout would be really obnoxious because being left with just Delver of Secrets probably is not enough to win from this position. And Bone Crusher dealing them an extra 2 points of damage when they do have to target it with a removal spell is a pretty good reward. I was really on the fence about it because I don't like giving my opponent's next turn, but I decided I was just going to be firing off Price of Progress no matter what in my opponent's next turn, and then living with the consequences. And it turned out that they did in fact have the Fire Spout. So this is a 1-for-1 removal spell is significantly better than cleaning out your hard to interact with Bone Crusher Giant. Okay, so here I Price of Progress because 6 damage when my opponent has no blue mana available is quite good. Magoose dies. And then I rip Fire Blast. Now I'm really excited because this is enough burn damage to actually just win the game. Obviously, Insect Elaboration is going to deliver 3 points here with my opponent not having access to mana. They're probably going to have to pay a life to Flooded Strand, assuming they want to cast more spells. So now Fire Blast is just lethal, and Bone Crusher Giant is a lethal threat by itself. I do decide here to just Stomp rather than play it, because it makes this lethal. If they have to counter this, I can kill them with Fire Blast in response. And if they have to tap mana to kill this when it attacks next turn, it lets me resolve this anyway. And the second clause on Bone Crusher Giant is about to be relevant, because if my opponent needs to obtain a third land to cast spells with, suddenly they actually can't target Bone Crusher Giant with anything, because the deal 2 damage to any target clause, the deal 2 damage to the spell's controller clause will kill them. So at this point I was fairly confident. I didn't think there were too many things my opponent could have to beat me. I thought I could probably win through even a double spell turn, but I wasn't 100% sure of that one. And Swords on Insect Liberation was a little frustrating because it lets them leave up a counterspell. And here, Bone Crusher Giant, if they have a counterspell, normally would get countered. And that would probably be fine because they're at 2 life and I can draw a very large number of spells to stack Fire Blast on top of. All my threats are sort of, potentially lethal at this point. But drawing Fire Blast is really just, the cherry on top. We're rewarded for being red mages. And I think it's Mana Leak again. Aether Gust, yeah. And so Aether Gust gets Fire Blasted. Bone Crusher sticks. And there are no good ways to get Bone Crusher off the battlefield at this point. You have to trade in combat with it, so you have to find some convoluted way to gain some life, which... and I thought this was both clever and cute, putting Abundant Growth on a fetch land. But at this point I was just waiting to draw a mountain to go off with Fire Blast. Which I drew, and I played, and then I served, and I assumed that if my opponent hadn't done anything on their turn, I was probably going to win when I attacked. They cast Snapcaster Mage, and that's when I knew that I was going to win. They have as I said, a cool convoluted way to try and gain some life with Swords to Plowshares. So they can block, swords their Snapcaster Mage, go to 4 life, have another turn to try and deal with this thing, etc. I let them cast the Swords to Plowshares before I do the thing, just in case, but then, Fire Blast them in response and hope they don't have Force of Negation plus blue card. If they did, I think you're still likely to win. They have to go down to 1 card. You've got a lethal threat in play. I think your deck wins quite a large percentage of those games. So yes, those games were interesting. Playing against 4-color control is, I think, a very fairly balanced match. I think it's very close. Neither deck really has a significant edge. In this circumstance, the moons come out. I brought in cards like, obviously, the blast effects, submerge, because often they play one big thing that's very good at blocking, like a Uro, or they use their Oko to steal one of your creatures, or they just try and make a food into a blocker, etc. You can maybe play dismember type effects, but I don't think you really need too many, and I think I'd rather have submerge than dismember. And mental misstep is obviously excellent. In terms of what you cut, I take the moons out on the play. I take the moons out on the draw, leave them in on the play, and you can trim some of your worst burn spells. So Firebolt's a bit of a clunky one. They have no mana elves to tag early, so it's really like a 6 mana deal 4 damage, which is not particularly fantastic. Rift Bolt and similar Skewer the Critics, so that's what I was thinking of. Rift Bolt and Skewer the Critics are sort of exactly okay. Jace Vryn's Prodigy is another one that, draw discard against this deck is exactly average. They are definitely going to outvalue card for card, and waiting 2 or 3 turns to flashback a burn spell is, again, exactly average. So you can definitely cut it. Your main plan is to force them to kill things in combat to save on damage, and then you get to use your second main phase to stick a Planeswalker or stick an annoying thing like a Magus of the Moon or a Sulfuric Vortex. And you can also lean quite heavily on the flash interaction with Hull Breacher. Hull Breacher in their end step means that they have to counter it or kill it then, rather than having a bunch of their cards cut off. And then you can untap, attack them, force them to make decisions, and you don't have to cast your Wheel if you have it, or other spells into their mana. You can just force them to deal with Hull Breacher straight away. Similar to Vendilion Clique and Control Mirrors. And the other card that I find really valuable here is Exquisite Firecraft. I often hold on to it for a very long time, because firing it off on the turn where they have specifically left 3 mana up before they're trying to bridge the gap to, a flash or an escaped Uro or similar, often is game breaking. I didn't make too many changes to the list. You can say I added an Ancient Tomb and a Sprite Dragon, added this for Harsh Mentor. I think this is probably just better. Even though we have a lot of creatures, I'm very happy with how this has gone. I very much recommend playing it. So Fireblast is the last card you can't quite see. You can tailor the sideboard however you see fit. You've got access to some of the best cards with the blasts and similar, but I think this deck does a really good impression of a small red aggro deck that also happens to have some nut draws with the Moxen, Simian Spirit Guide, Ancient Tomb that are just too hard to deal with for a fair deck. So if you have any further thoughts, please comment, message me on Discord. I'm more than happy to talk about this further. Otherwise, good luck in the league and hope you go well.